Chapter 8. After the new year came hiring out time. Master William decided he needed the cash hiring out would bring him more than he needed the help of Lizzie's son Henry. So Henry was sent to live and work at the Dorsey farm. It was plenty close enough for him to walk home on Sundays, so Lizzie and Tom and all Henry's little sisters and even little Evan didn't cry too hard when he left. Outside it was cold, the ground was frozen, the trees bare, and the fields brown and sad-looking. Fewer people stopped at the inn these days, but there was still work to be done, corn to be shelled and carted to the grist mill up the road in Triadelphia, tobacco to be pressed and weighed and loaded into barrels. There was finally time to patch and mend their well-worn clothes and to push lumps of mud into the gaps in the walls of their cabin to help keep out the cold. And, of course, the Price's horses and oxen, chickens, sheep, and pigs needed more care than ever now that there was nothing for them to graze on or forage for. Benjamin stopped asking about his mother and began to call Anne's mother Mama. Arabella said the Lord just made the little ones like that, so when their mama died or got sold far away, they wouldn't waste away from the pain of it. Anne often wondered how Ellie was faring. She was sure Ellie hadn't forgotten her son as quickly as he had seemed to forget her. Benjamin was never far from Arabella. He went with her to the tavern when there was dinner or breakfast to cook for customers, and he crawled up on her lap in the evenings when she sat in front of the fire to sew. Sometimes Arabella laid down her sewing and played patty cake with Benjamin, or cuddled him or told him Brer Rabbit stories. As Anne watched them one evening, she realized that Benjamin was about the same age her baby brother would have been had he lived. She tried to imagine that it was he who sat on her mother's lap, grown to a young boy and strong, but quickly her mind went back to the night 4 winters ago when her infant son burned hot with fever, and how, despite a night of prayer and cloths soaked in honeysuckle tea pressed to his delicate limbs, Anne awoke to find her baby brother cold and stiff in her mother's arms. She remembered how they'd buried him. "Thank the Lord, now he'll never be a slave," her mother had said, her voice dry as crackling leaves, and her father had sobbed as he shoveled dirt into the hole, covering the tiny box that held his son. Yet here was Benjamin filling her mother's lap, and now that he lived with them, he was much safer from the back of Mistress Carol's hand. Anne smiled at herself. She must be becoming like her father, she thought, able to find the hidden blessings in the middle of the sad things in life. Sundays were quieter now. It was too cold to meet in the clearing, so smaller groups gathered in various cabins and said their prayers quietly so as not to be caught worshiping without a white person present. Sunday afternoons were spent indoors in front of the fire listening to stories, unless, of course, there was snow. That one particular Sunday, the snow began to fall during the night, and by morning it lay thick and quiet. When Anne went out back to wash, she gathered a handful of snow from the top of the wash bucket, rubbed it over her face and neck, and dried herself with the stiff rag hanging above the bucket. If her mother insisted on washing today, this seemed an appropriate way to do it. With the snow falling so heavily, they dared not venture to another farm for worship, so they shared their prayers in front of the hearth. Anne could hardly sit still. She was so anxious to get back outside. Joseph and Addison were easily coaxed to join her, and after some prodding, even Augustus put on his jacket and came out. The 4 of them ran down the hill toward the pond, which was frozen quite solid and now had several inches of snow on top. Anne ran along on the ice, her rag-wrapped feet making huge prints in the fluffy snow. Then she stopped abruptly and slid across the ice. She hollered at the joy of it. Her brothers imitated her, running and skittering across the pond on their feet, their knees and their bellies. Soon, despite their threadbare clothing, their faces were bright with sweat. Anne didn't even mind it when a snowball hit her squarely in the back of the neck. She wheeled around to find Richard gathering another handful to throw. Richard had the advantage of leather boots, several sizes too big, but easier to run in than Rags, and gloves to keep his hands from freezing. But the Weems children had the advantage of 4-on-1. So it was Richard, plastered white and breathless after a snowball fight that rivaled the Battle of Bunker Hill, who begged for mercy. They sat together to rest, and Richard said innocently, "You folks must be happy to be leaving this boring place." Anne exchanged a curious glance with Augustus. Richard didn't wait for a response, but kept on talking. "I wish I was moving to Rockville. My pa said almost 400 people lived there. They have the county fair in September, and people come from all over just to see it. They've got a courthouse, and they've even got a jail." "Who's moving to Rockville?" Augustus asked. Richard stared hard at Augustus, then at Addison, then at Joseph, then at Anne. They each watched him, wondering why he looked so confused. "You are," he blurted out. "Didn't my brother tell you?" Anne's eyes widened. Certainly one need only have walked by Master Charles once or twice in the past month to overhear him complaining about his debts and how farming was no way to make a living and how he was ready to try something else. But Anne had never suspected he would move away from Unity to do it. "Are you telling us a story?" Augustus scowled at Richard. "I'm telling you the truth," Richard insisted. "I heard my brother say, plain as day, he's fixing to sell the last of the harvest and the animals and move to Rockville." Anne found herself grinning at the news. Rockville? Do they really have a jail there? Joseph wanted to know. And the county fair? Can anyone go or just the white folks? Addison asked. Anne elbowed Addison. "That's the fair Hannah and David went to last year. Of course, anyone can go." Richard answered their questions and told them about the fine houses on Montgomery Avenue and on Washington Street, houses that stood so close to each other, folks could look into each other's windows. He told how he'd driven in a carriage near enough the jailhouse to see it, though he didn't know if there was a prisoner inside at the time. The discussion with Richard and later with her family fueled a growing excitement in Anne. The county fair, as she'd heard about it from her cousin, sounded like the most wonderful experience imaginable. She would be sad to leave Unity, but moving to Rockville would be a grand adventure. Anne had a whole week of dreaming from that snowy Sunday until the next warm, muddy Saturday. She imagined her mother being allowed to make her own jam, with her name on the jar, to enter in the women's cooking competition at the fair. She imagined Augustus entering the plowing races and winning first prize for Master Charles. She imagined going to the market for Mistress Carol and walking on the streets next to the fine houses. She had a week of dreaming and hoping and planning before everything changed. Master Charles was in a horrid state all week, shouting orders, threatening with the whip, and forcing her father and brothers to work from before dawn until after sunset with hardly 5 minutes to take their meals. He drove them to shell mountains of corn, press and weigh piles of tobacco, and load all this, along with many sacks of wheat, into his own wagon and his father's. It was as if he was determined to sell off all of his harvest on one market day and leave nothing for them to eat for the rest of the winter. Very early Saturday morning, with the stars still shining in the sky, Lizzie's husband, Tom, knocked on their door and said Master Charles wanted the boys to come help unload the sacks and barrels at market. They were headed to Baltimore with the 2 wagons and could not be expected to arrive home before very late that night. Tom promised to have Joseph and Addison ride with him in Master William's wagon and to keep an eye on them while they were in Baltimore. Augustus would ride with Master Charles and was old enough to watch out for himself. Arabella worried at the thought of her young boy spending the day in such a large, unpredictable city. Tom just laughed and said Baltimore wasn't anything but a small town that liked to put on airs. There was no time to cook breakfast, but Tom said he had a big enough slab of cold cornmeal mush to share with the boys. Anne rubbed her eyes as she watched Tom lead the sleepy crew up the hill to the barn. Most of the snow from last Sunday had melted, and the ground was an ugly mix of dirty snow and slushy earth. It was exactly the kind of mix that likes to suck wagon wheels into it and make a trip to Baltimore and back take 2 or 3 days instead of 1. Anne was glad her brothers had taken their blankets with them. It was a scene Anne would never forget. Tom with his arm around Joseph, Addison, and Augustus trudging next to them, the four heads bobbing as they made their way up the hill in the moonlight, shoulders hunched under the blankets that minutes before had covered their sleeping forms. Saturday night, it was the mud they blamed it on. Those wagons were weighed down so heavy they probably had to push them all the way to Baltimore, said her father. We'll see them sometime in the morning, I reckon. Sunday at church, Lizzie was worried too, and they blamed it on the rain clouds that threatened. I suppose Master Charles had best get himself a room at an inn, said Arabella. If it rains and those roads get any muddier, they'll get stuck for sure. When Monday dawned, sunny and dry and the mud crusted over and cracked, they searched for something else to blame. Maybe they broke a wheel, her father began, then trailed off. By evening, Anne's mother had begun a nervous pacing, the way she did when her insides told her something was wrong. Mama, come sit, said Catherine. They're with Tom and Master Charles. They'll be all right. But Arabella wouldn't sit, and it turned dark without anyone going to bed. When they heard the knock at the door, they stumbled over one another to get to it. Tom stood on their doorstep, his clothes caked with mud, his face streaked with tears. Where are they? Her father demanded, his voice choked into a growl. Gone. Sold to Alabama. The words sliced Anne's heart. As Anne's father crumbled to his knees, Arabella's voice rose in a wail, one word, no, drawn out like the cry of wind through dead trees.